Rising souls, when was the last time an emotion made your decision for you? Not you, the emotion. Maybe it was anger that made you say something you immediately regretted. Maybe it was fear that kept you from taking that step. Or maybe, this one sneaks up quietly, it was shame, sitting in your chest, telling you to stay small. We've all been there. Here's what nobody talks about honestly. Most of us were never taught how to handle emotions. We were told to calm down, to think positive, to just get over it. As if emotions are math equations with clean answers. They're not. Emotions are signals. Ancient, deeply personal messages your inner life is sending you. When you don't know how to read them, when you just react, those messages turn into traps. You become the person who explodes at the people they love most, or shrinks when life gets hard, or numbs everything out with busyness, because feeling anything seems too risky. But what if you could feel everything, the anger, the grief, the anxiety, and still choose how you respond? That's what this video is about, not quick tips, not breathing exercises. The oldest wisdom humanity has ever produced, written thousands of years ago and still holding because it was built from honest observation of human nature. Epictetus said it plainly, "Men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about the things." It's not the emotion that destroys you, it's the story you build around it. That's where the real work happens, and that's exactly where we're going today. If you're ready to stop being dragged around by your own reactions, like this video, drop a comment, share it, subscribe to this channel, and do not skip any part. Every section builds on the next. Miss one, and you might miss the exact thing that changes everything. Before we go any further, type this in the comments and claim it as yours. I feel deeply. I choose wisely. Number 1. Understand what negative emotions actually are, because you've been taught wrong. No man is free who is not master of himself. Epictetus. Before mastering emotions, you have to rethink what emotions even are. Most people believe negative emotions are problems, signs that something is wrong with them. Anxiety means weak, anger means difficult, sadness means broken, shame means not enough. So they fight the emotions, suppress them, perform happiness in public while falling apart privately. Or they let emotions run wild because they never learned any other option. Here's what's actually true. The ancient Stoics understood something about emotion that most people haven't grasped yet. They called raw emotional reactions path, automatic surges that arise before reason responds, and they distinguished these from eupatheiai, wise, considered responses that come after honest reflection. The Stoics were never saying, "Feel nothing." That is the greatest misreading of Stoic philosophy. What they were saying, understand what you're feeling, examine it, then choose from wisdom rather than impulse. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That single distinction between what happens to you and how you interpret it is the foundation of everything. Anger is not a personality flaw. Aristotle wrote carefully about right anger, felt toward the right person, to the right degree, at the right time. The problem is almost never that people feel anger. The problem is they feel it toward the wrong things, with the wrong intensity, with no wisdom guiding the response. Fear is not cowardice. The Stoics saw fear as the natural response of a mind not yet trained to distinguish real threat from perceived threat. Seneca wrote, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." Think about how much of your fear concerns things that haven't happened, may never happen. Your mind generates the threat, vivid, convincing, and your inner life responds as if it's already at the door. Sadness is not weakness. Across Stoic, Buddhist, and Confucian traditions, grief was understood as the natural response to genuine loss. Not something to rush through, something to honor, move through with intention, and integrate honestly. The Buddha taught that suffering, dukkha, is not caused by painful events, but by our relationship to them, our clinging, our resistance, our desperate wish that things were different. That teaching is 2,500 years old, and it holds. Here's what this means practically. When a difficult emotion rises, shift from "this is a problem" to "this is information." That single reframe changes your entire inner relationship. You stop fighting yourself. You start getting curious. And curiosity is where self-mastery begins. The Stoic practice of prosoche, continuous non-judgmental self-attention, made this a daily discipline. When an emotion rises, name it precisely. Not, "I feel bad." Are you frustrated or embarrassed? Anxious or grieving something you haven't admitted yet? The more precisely you name it, the more your thinking mind engages, and the less the raw surge carries you away without consent. Lao Tzu wrote, "Knowing others is intelligence. Knowing yourself is true wisdom." This is the beginning of that knowing. Honest, precise attention to what is actually moving through you. One more thing most people overlook. Emotions, when genuinely allowed rather than suppressed or amplified by story, tend to move. They rise, peak, and settle, if you don't keep re-triggering them with anxious thought. The Stoics described this as the passing of a wave. The problem is, most people never let the wave pass. They fight it, judge themselves for it, or build a story around it that keeps it churning. The emotion doesn't trap you. The story around the emotion traps you. This one is for every person who ever called their emotions a weakness. Drop this below. My emotions teach. I listen. Number 2, the difference between reacting and responding, and why that gap is everything. Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Viktor E. Frankl. Understanding emotions intellectually and actually living that understanding, two completely different things. You can know anger is a signal and still slam a door. You can know anxiety is misplaced fear and still cancel plans because showing up feels impossible. Knowledge alone doesn't change behavior. What changes behavior is learning to live in the gap. Epictetus, born a slave, who earned his freedom through philosophy, wrote, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." Inside that instruction is a pause, a deliberate space between impulse and action. The Stoics called it diastema, the interval. Cultivating that interval was the core work of an examined life. Most people have an interval of about 0. Something happens. They react. The reaction causes damage. Hours later, they sit with the aftermath wondering, why do I keep doing this? Marcus Aurelius practiced this discipline daily. He reminded himself, confine yourself to the present, not the story about what might happen next, not the memory of what happened before, the present moment, where the impression is still just an impression, not yet a verdict. So how do you widen the gap practically? Physical interruption. The Stoics understood the body's role in emotional experience. Slow, deliberate breathing creates the half-second your thinking mind needs to re-enter the picture. One exhale, that's enough to begin. Language delay. Seneca wrote, "I shall consider this more carefully." Phrases like, "give me a moment" or "let me think about that," create micro-delays, not passivity, strategy. A significant difference. A redirecting question, instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" which delivers a story that keeps you trapped. Ask, "What would a wise person do here?" Marcus Aurelius used exactly this. He asked what his philosophical mentor would do, not to imitate blindly, but to access a wiser perspective than the one his emotion was currently offering. The goal is never to eliminate reaction entirely. Confucius taught that the superior person, the Yunzi, was not someone who felt nothing. They felt appropriately, anger at genuine injustice, joy at real good fortune. The cultivation wasn't toward numbness. It was toward proportion and timing. The goal is choice. The Stoics called consistent practice of this ascesis, disciplined daily training. Some days the gap is wide. Some days something catches you off guard and it narrows to almost nothing. That is not failure. That is being human in an imperfect world. What separates people who grow from people who stay stuck is not that they never get swept away. It's that they notice it faster each time. If you are done reacting and ready to start responding, prove it right now in the comments. I pause, I choose, I win. Number 3. Why you keep going back to the same emotional patterns and how to finally break them. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Carl Jung. Why do you keep ending up in the same emotional place? Even when you know better? You've had the realizations, made the promises, and yet the same anger, the same anxiety spiral, the same collapse into self-doubt. It feels like something is broken at a fundamental level. Like this is just who you are. It's not who you are. It's a pattern, and patterns can be changed. The ancient Greeks called ingrained patterns of behavior ethos, habitual character. The accumulated weight of repeated choices, slowly hardening into what feels like fixed personality. Aristotle observed with precision, we are what we repeatedly do, not what we intend, not what we believe about ourselves. What we repeatedly do, including how we repeatedly respond to difficult emotions. Your inner life has been collecting data since childhood, building emotional templates, automatic programs shaped by early experience, by what felt safe and what felt dangerous. When something in your current life resembles something from your past, even vaguely, the old program runs, fast, without asking your permission. The Stoics called these ingrained dispositions hexis, not destiny, but habits so automatic they feel like fixed character. Confucius addressed how they form. By 3 methods we may learn wisdom. First, by reflection, which is noblest. Second, by imitation, which is easiest. And third, by experience, which is the bitterest. Most emotional patterns were learned through bitter early experience. These patterns feel like personality, but Aristotle also offered this. It is possible to fail in many ways, but to succeed is possible only in one way. The way to change a pattern is not to fight it directly. That strengthens it. The way is to understand its origin, meet the underlying need it was trying to serve, and then deliberately choose differently. Each time you choose differently in a situation that used to trigger the old response, you lay down what the Greeks called a new hexis, a new groove, a new habit of character. There is also something worth naming that ancient wisdom recognized, something uncomfortable. Sometimes patterns persist, not just because they're automatic, but because part of you is still receiving something from them. The anxiety that prevents you from taking risks that might end in rejection. The anger that keeps people at a distance that feels, on some level, safer than closeness. The Buddhist concept of upadana, clinging, speaks to this. We cling not only to pleasant things, we cling to painful patterns too, when those patterns have become familiar enough to feel like identity. The Buddha taught, the mind is everything. What you think, you become. What you repeatedly rehearse in the theater of your inner life becomes your lived experience. The work is layered: awareness to catch the pattern early, honest inquiry into what need it serves, compassion for the circumstances in which it formed, and repeated new choices, because that is what actually changes character, one decision at a time. Seneca warned against expecting rapid transformation. Hang on to this thought and hold it dear. Never let the good things you've started slip away. Slow, honest, consistent progress. That is the path. The moment you see the pattern, it loses its power over you. Declare that power right here. I see my patterns. I break them. Number 4. The hidden language of your body. What your physical sensations are trying to tell you. To the mind that is still, the whole universe surrenders. Lao Tzu. Where do you feel your emotions? Not conceptually, physically. Where in your actual body does anxiety live? Where does anger sit? Where does grief land when it arrives? Most people have never been asked that question, and that gap, the disconnect between thinking mind and living body, may be one of the biggest reasons emotional mastery stays elusive. We've been trained to live from the neck up, to think about feelings rather than feel them, to analyze and intellectualize, while the body, carrying the actual weight of everything, gets completely ignored. The body doesn't forget. Ancient philosophy understood this far more deeply than modern culture typically acknowledges. The Greeks did not share our split between mind and body. They spoke of soma and psyche as deeply interconnected, one unified human experience. Hippocrates observed, "It is more important to know what sort of person has a disease than to know what sort of disease a person has." The Stoics practiced melity, deliberate attention, applied not just to thought, but to physical awareness. Paying attention to how the body responds to circumstance was considered legitimate philosophical inquiry. Seneca wrote, "We should every night call ourselves to an account. What infirmity have I mastered today? What passions opposed?" Notice, mastered, not denied. Which requires first noticing what is present in the body, in the breath, in the sensations that arise before thought constructs its story. The Taoist tradition takes this further. Lao Tzu taught that the Tao flows through all things, including the human body. The person who has learned to be still enough to feel that flow accesses a knowing the restless mind cannot reach. Stillness here is not passivity. It is the inner quiet that makes honest perception possible. Here's something practical you can use today. When a difficult emotion rises, ask 3 questions. Where am I feeling this in my body? Specific, not everywhere. Where exactly? Chest, jaw, gut. What does it feel like physically? Heavy or light? Sharp or dull? Hot or cold? Give it texture. This is precision, not poetry. If this sensation could speak, what would it say? The Stoics believed every inner experience carried information. Discomfort was not meaningless noise. It was the deeper self attempting to communicate through the only channel still open. A tight chest, when you genuinely listen, may be saying, "I am exhausted," and have been pretending otherwise. A clenched jaw may be holding, "I have stayed silent too long about something that matters." These are not dramatic revelations. They are quiet ones. But across every wisdom tradition we've inherited, Stoic, Buddhist, Taoist, Confucian, the quiet, honest perception of one's inner reality is treated as the beginning of all genuine wisdom. Marcus Aurelius, writing alone in his tent during military campaigns, wrote not about strategy and empire, but about his own inner life, his fears, his frustrations, his attempts to return to equanimity when circumstance pulled him away. He understood that the inner world requires the same quality of attention as the outer one. The body is not your enemy. It has been keeping faithful record of everything you've experienced, and waiting with remarkable patience for you to finally listen. Your body has been talking for years. Today you start listening. Honor that by typing this, "My body speaks, I hear it." Number 5. How to stop emotional suppression without letting emotions run wild. The middle path. Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. Aristotle. Here's a tension nobody talks about honestly. One side says, feel everything, express it all, suppression is toxic. The other side says, discipline your mind, control yourself, don't let emotions dictate your life. Most people swing between these two extremes, suppressing everything until it explodes, or expressing everything without filter and calling it authenticity. Both extremes cause damage. Neither is mastery. The ancient philosophical traditions pointed almost unanimously toward a third path. The Buddha called it Majjhima Patipada, the middle way. Not a compromise between bad options, a qualitatively different path, conscious, skilled relationship with inner experience wide enough to hold difficulty without being destroyed by it. Suppression happens in tiny daily ways. A flicker of sadness, immediately distracted. Irritation with someone, told it's not worth it. A wave of loneliness, phone reached for before the feeling is even registered. These small suppressions accumulate. Layer by layer they build an emotional backlog, pressure with nowhere healthy to go. Seneca was clear, suppress it and it festers, release it wisely and it heals. The Taoist tradition expressed this through water. Water doesn't fight obstacles, it flows around them. Dam it completely, and pressure builds until the dam breaks. The same holds for emotional energy denied every legitimate outlet, but unchecked expression is equally destructive. Not everything rising in you needs to be voiced to another person. Not every angry thought needs to be spoken. There's a version of expressing feelings that is simply unleashing unprocessed emotional energy onto people nearby. It amplifies emotion rather than processes it. Aristotle's concept of sophrosine, temperance, addressed this precisely. Not the absence of feeling, the skilled, proportionate, well-timed expression of it, feeling the right things in the right measure at the right moment. The middle path looks like processing rather than performing, sitting with an emotion long enough to understand it before broadcasting it. Marcus Aurelius and Seneca both practiced daily journaling for exactly this reason. Not for an audience, for clarity, moving emotion from undifferentiated swirl into specific, honest words that made examination possible. It looks like gradual approach, engaging with difficult emotions in manageable doses. The Stoics practiced premeditatio malorum, calm contemplation of difficulty before it arrives, not anxious rumination. Considered engagement so that when difficulty actually appears, the inner life isn't ambushed. It looks like chosen expression, deciding deliberately when, how, and with whom to share what you're feeling. Not suppressing, not dumping, choosing. And it looks like physical engagement, legitimate outlets for emotional energy through the body. The Greeks understood this through catharsis, the emotional clarification that comes through physical and creative expression. Movement, exercise, creative work are not distractions from emotion. They are ancient pathways for emotional energy to complete its natural cycle. Most difficult emotions are asking for one of three things: to be acknowledged without judgment, to be understood beneath the surface story, or to be integrated into your understanding of yourself rather than locked away. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Look within. Within is the fountain of good, and it will ever bubble up if thou wilt ever dig." Digging, not covering over. Carefully, honestly, with patience. That is the middle path. And the middle path is where emotional freedom lives. Stop running, start facing. If you are ready for that shift, leave this in the comments. I feel it, I face it, I free it. Number 6. The art of emotional boundaries, protecting your inner world without shutting people out. He who knows others is wise. He who knows himself is enlightened. Lao Tzu. Boundaries. The word splits people instantly. One group rolls their eyes. It sounds like an excuse to be difficult. The other uses it as a shield to justify emotional avoidance. Neither is right. In the context of real emotional mastery, the ability to maintain your inner ground in relationship with others is not optional, it is structural. The architecture that makes everything else sustainable. You cannot regulate your inner life in a vacuum. You live in relationship with partners, family, colleagues, strangers online who can ruin your afternoon with a single comment. Your emotional landscape is constantly being shaped by people around you. If you absorb everything, if every other person's emotional weather becomes yours, all the inner work in the world won't hold. You'll find equanimity alone and fall apart the moment someone pushes a button. The Stoics address this with their most foundational distinction. Epictetus opened the Enchiridion with it. Some things are in our control and others not. Things in our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion. Things not in our control are body, reputation, and whatever are not our own actions. Other people's emotions, reactions, moods, not within your power. What is within your power is whether you allow them to colonize your inner space without consent. An emotional boundary is not a wall, it is a root system. The tree bends in the wind, the roots hold. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be one." That instruction contains a boundary, not against people, but around your own values. A refusal to be pulled from your own inner ground by noise, criticism, or chaos. Practically, this has 3 layers. Know your own center first. The Stoics practiced daily melite, a morning review of principles before the day began. Genuine contact with your own values and inner state. You cannot protect what you don't know. Regular, honest self-contact before the world has a chance to pull you in 12 directions is foundational. Learn to notice when you've been displaced. There is a moment, sometimes subtle, when you shift from "I am present with this person" to "I am being carried by this person's reality." The Stoic practice of prososh makes this moment recognizable earlier. It shows up physically first. A contraction. Your own thoughts going quiet as someone else's intensity floods the space. When you notice it, return to your own ground, internally first. Like a compass needle finding north. Distinguish empathy from dissolution. Confucius placed enormous importance on Ren, genuine active care for others, as the highest virtue. But Ren in Confucian thought was never the dissolution of self into others. It was care offered from inner clarity and stability. Lao Tzu offered the image of the empty vessel, useful precisely because of its emptiness, its capacity. Fill it completely with someone else's pain, and it loses its function. You can be genuinely present for another person's experience without being overtaken by it. That presence, grounded and clear, is more useful to them than the kind of absorbed care that leaves both of you drowning. Some relationships and environments may be genuinely incompatible with your inner growth. The Epicureans were meticulous about the environments they chose. Epicurus wrote, "Of all the things which wisdom provides to make us entirely happy, much the greatest is the possession of friendship." The implication: not all company qualifies as friendship. Not all environments support wisdom. Choosing carefully is not withdrawal. It is the practical recognition that even the most grounded person needs conditions where growth remains possible. Choose your environments as carefully as you choose your inner practices. They are, in many ways, inseparable. You can love people fully without losing yourself in them. Remind yourself with this: rooted inside, open outside. Number 7. Rewriting the stories you tell yourself. Because the narrative is the prison. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. John Milton. This one goes deepest. Raw emotions, the immediate biological surge, tend to move through and settle when genuinely allowed. So why do some emotional states last for hours, days, years? Because of the story. The moment an emotion arises, your mind reaches instantly for a narrative, an explanation, a meaning. Why is this happening? What does this mean about me, about them, about my future, my worth? And the story your mind reaches for determines everything that happens next. The Stoics identified this process precisely. They called the ruling faculty of interpretation hegemonikon, and they understood it was constantly constructing interpretations of experience, not simply receiving them. The same event generates completely different emotional experiences depending on the interpretation applied. Epictetus. People are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about the things. Same event, two different opinions, two completely different inner lives. Someone doesn't reply for 3 days. Story 1, they're occupied, not about me. Story 2, they're ignoring me. I said something wrong. I'm too much. People always leave. Same silence, completely different suffering. Your stories feel true. They feel like neutral observation of reality. They are not. Almost every story your mind tells about an emotional event is a construction, shaped by history, fear, unmet needs, and the patterns we've already discussed. Deeply edited, not neutral. The Stoics recognized 3 characteristic distortions in painful stories, tied to what Marcus Aurelius called the 3 disciplines of desire, action, and assent. When the discipline of assent fails, stories tend to treat difficulty as permanent. This will never change. As universal, this affects everything, nothing works. And as a verdict on the self, this happened because of what I fundamentally am. Seneca identified this pattern in his letters. There is nothing so wretched or foolish as to anticipate misfortune. What madness it is in your expecting evil before it arrives. The good news, this habit of narrative can be examined, questioned, and with honest practice, rewritten, not with forced optimism, but with the Stoic practice of the view from above. Stepping back from the emotionally charged interpretation and asking, is this story accurate, or is it a distortion generated by pain? Is this actually permanent, or does it feel permanent because I am inside the difficulty? Marcus Aurelius returned constantly to impermanence. What feels fixed rarely is. The certainty of permanence during difficulty is almost always distortion. Is this actually universal, or am I generalizing from one hard moment to my entire existence? One relationship failing does not mean all relationships fail. The Stoics called this globalization of pain one of the primary errors of the undisciplined mind. Is this a verdict on who I am, or a description of what happened? I failed at this describes an event. I am a failure issues a verdict on a person. Your mind blurs this line constantly. Your job is to hold it clearly. The Buddha taught, you yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. That is not sentimentality. It is the philosophical foundation of a mind that can hold difficulty without collapsing into self-condemnation. Many of the most painful stories were not originally yours. They were handed to you by people who had their own unexamined stories. before you had the language or power to question them. Confucius taught that self-cultivation, the patient, lifelong work of refining character, is always possible, regardless of what came before. It does not matter how slowly you go as long as you do not stop. The story changes when you start questioning it, and questioning begins the moment you recognize, this is an interpretation I'm running, not a fact I'm receiving. That recognition is quiet, but it is enormous. Someone handed you a painful story once. Today you take the pen back. Write this below. I write my story. Nothing else does. Number 8. Building emotional resilience, not the fake kind, the real kind. Fall 7 times, stand up 8. Japanese proverb. Resilience is one of the most overused words in personal development, on posters, in seminars. Thrown around so casually, it has started losing its actual meaning. So, let's strip everything performative away. Resilience is not toughness, not pretending things don't hurt, not the ability to keep going without breaking, because everyone breaks sometimes, and those who claim otherwise are either performing strength or dangerously disconnected from themselves. Real resilience is the capacity to move through difficulty without being permanently defined by it, to bend, genuinely bend, and find your way back to yourself. Not to who you were before the hard thing happened, necessarily, but to a version of yourself that has integrated the experience and kept going. The ancient philosophical traditions understood this deeply. The Book of Job from the Hebrew wisdom tradition presents a human being stripped of everything, and the central question is not, how do I avoid suffering, but how does a person remain themselves when suffering arrives? The answer that emerges is not cheerful, but it is honest, and it points to something modern culture often misses. Difficulty engaged with honestly has genuine transformative potential. Seneca wrote, "It is not that I am brave, but that I know what is not worth fearing." That is resilience in its most ancient form, not the absence of fear. The training of discernment, learning to distinguish between what genuinely threatens your well-being and what merely threatens your comfort, your pride, your preferences. How is genuine resilience actually built? First, practiced acceptance of impermanence. Marcus Aurelius returned to this theme in Meditations with almost obsessive regularity, not from morbidity, but because he recognized that resistance to change is the mind's greatest source of unnecessary suffering. The Stoic practice of memento mori, calm remembrance of impermanence, was preparation, not pessimism. A mind genuinely at peace with impermanence recovers from change far more fluidly because it is no longer surprised by it. Second, meaning-making. The Stoics taught amor fati, love of fate, not passive resignation, active philosophical embrace of difficulty as the material from which character is built. This was hard, and something real was forged in it. That kind of honest story, holding both difficulty and growth simultaneously, is one you can actually live inside without it becoming a cage. Third, connection. Individualistic culture frames resilience as solo achievement. It is not. Aristotle was direct. Man is by nature a social animal. The Epicurean gardens, Stoic circles, Buddhist Sangha, these communities of philosophical practice were not incidental to inner development. They were part of it. Being genuinely known by at least one person, with your difficulty and imperfection met with honest care, is not luxury. It is a fundamental human need. Fourth, an honest relationship with failure. The ancient traditions were consistent. Failure is not a moral category. It is information. Confucius, who failed repeatedly in efforts to bring his principles into political practice, never interpreted those failures as verdicts on his worth. He continued, he refined. Every time you fail, recover honestly, extract what's useful, and continue. You build lived evidence that failure is survivable. That evidence accumulates. The fear of failure begins to hold less authority over your choices. Every hard thing you survived made you more than you were before. Own that right now. Hard things build me, they don't break me. Number 9. Emotional mastery as a daily practice, not a destination you arrive at. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act but a habit. Aristotle. Here's something that needs to be said honestly, because without it, everything we've covered today could become another source of pressure rather than liberation. Emotional mastery is not a place you arrive at. There is no moment where the work is done, no permanent state of unshakable equanimity where difficult emotions no longer touch you. No final certification. That version of mastery doesn't exist. And chasing it, treating emotional growth as a problem to be finally solved, is one of the subtler ways people keep themselves perpetually dissatisfied. The ancient philosophical traditions understood this with clarity. The Stoics spoke not of having achieved wisdom, but of moving toward it. The Stoic sage, the person of complete wisdom, was considered an ideal perhaps no actual human being had ever fully reached. Not because the ideal was meaningless, because the value was in the practice of moving toward it. The procopter, the one making progress, was considered a genuinely noble form of flourishing, even without a rival. Marcus Aurelius, with all the power of the ancient world at his disposal, wrote near the end of his life, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He wrote it as a reminder to himself. After decades of practice, the reminder was still necessary. That's not failure. That's what the practice actually looks like. So, what does daily emotional mastery look like on an ordinary Tuesday? Morning, the Stoic morning review. Before demands flood in, take 60 seconds of honest self-contact. What challenges might today bring? What values do I want to carry? Marcus Aurelius began many meditations entries exactly this way, anchoring in principles before the world had a chance to pull him from them. Throughout the day, micro-pauses, brief moments of conscious return. Between tasks, between conversations, one breath, one internal check. Where am I? What am I feeling? Am I still acting from my values? No extra time required. Only the intention to remember periodically that an inner life is happening and deserves honest attention. Evening, the Stoic evening review. Seneca examined his day honestly every night. What did I handle well? Where was I pulled from my values? Not self-judgment, honest accounting that makes tomorrow slightly more conscious than today. When the weight is heavy, seek wisdom from others. Emotional mastery does not mean carrying everything alone. Seneca learned from teachers. Marcus Aurelius listed every person who shaped his formation with deep gratitude. Knowing when a weight is beyond what you should carry alone, and choosing not to carry it, is wisdom at its most honest. Finally, philanthropia toward yourself. The Greeks extended this concept of love for humanity explicitly to include oneself, not vanity. The basic recognition that you deserve the same quality of care you would willingly offer others. Many people drawn to growth carry an inner critic that is relentless. It watches every stumble and uses it as evidence of permanent inadequacy. That voice is not wisdom. It is suffering disguised as high standards. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Accept the things to which fate binds you, and love the people with whom fate brings you together, and do so with all your heart." That love, extended inward to the self doing its imperfect best in an imperfect world, is the soil in which everything else we've discussed today grows. Be patient with yourself. Be honest with yourself. Keep showing up. That is the practice. That is the whole thing. Growth is not always loud or visible, but it is always real. Celebrate yours right here. Showing up is enough. I am growing. We've covered significant ground today, and I don't want to flatten it into a list. What we've built together is not a checklist. It's a new relationship with your own inner life, one rooted in thousands of years of humanity's most honest thinking about what it means to live well inside a difficult world. The goal was never control in the suppressive sense. The ancient philosophers, Stoic, Buddhist, Taoist, Confucian, were unanimous. Emotions are not the enemy of a good life. Unexamined, unconscious reactions to emotions, those are the source of most suffering. The goal is understanding, skill, and choice. You now understand that emotions are information, not character flaws. You understand the Stoic gap between stimulus and response. Widening it through daily practice is where freedom lives. You know your emotional patterns were formed for real reasons and can be reshaped through new habit, as Aristotle taught. You've been introduced to your body's language and the ancient wisdom that inner and physical life were never meant to be separate. You understand the middle way between suppression and flood. You know emotional boundaries are root systems, not walls. You've examined the stories you tell yourself and recognized, with Epictetus, that interpretations are not facts. You've understood what real resilience looks like, worn, honest, built through difficulty, and you've understood that mastery is a daily practice, offered to yourself with patience and the ancient virtue of self-compassion. That is not small. That is a lifetime's worth of foundational wisdom, compressed and made practical. But wisdom, as Confucius reminded us, is not the same as the practice of wisdom. Practice begins not someday, not when things settle, but in the very next moment something difficult rises in you. That moment will come. It always does, and when it does, you now have more than you had before. A framework built not from trend or fashion, but from the tested observations of human beings who faced these same inner challenges centuries ago with the same fundamental inner architecture. Use what they left you. You were never meant to be at the mercy of your own inner weather. You were built to feel deeply, fully, honestly, and you were built to choose, to respond with wisdom rather than react from unexamined habit, to move through hard things, not around them, and emerge with more self-knowledge than you carried in. That is the work, and you've already begun it, just by being here, just by staying all the way to the end. Your relationships will feel this shift. Your work will reflect it. The people who share your life will be touched by it, even if they can't name what changed. You becoming more emotionally free is not just good for you, it ripples. So, warriors, rising souls, go practice. Be patient. Turn toward what you've been turning away from. Widen the gap. Question the story. Listen to the body. Let the ancient wisdom that survived centuries because it is true. Let it actually live in you, not just inform you. If this video gave you something real, please like it. Not for the algorithm, as a signal to other people who need this. Share it with someone fighting their own inner battles right now. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. We go this deep every single time. Drop a comment. Tell me which point landed hardest. The body awareness, the pattern breaking, the Stoic gap, the stories. I read every comment, every one, and what you share genuinely shapes what comes next. You made it to the end, and that already says something powerful about you. Seal it with this: wisdom leads me. Emotions don't own me. Thank you for being here. Thank you for doing the work. The ancient philosophers would be proud of you. See you in the next one.